Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal exciting details on Wednesday, September 24, 2025. First, Trina was reaching a breaking point. Her pain no longer something she could contain within herself. The sight of her parents unraveling day after day cut deeply into her, leaving her torn between loyalty and despair. Portia and Curtis, once a pair who promised strength and stability, now stood as distant figures locked in silence, unable to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Their every interaction was strained, their affection seemingly drained away, and Trina could feel the foundation of her family slipping like sand between her fingers. What made it unbearable was not only the loss of her family's unity but also the sense that outside forces were pushing them further apart, testing their ability to endure when they were already fragile. Curtis, weighed down by the shocking ordeal of Stella's arrest, seemed constantly distracted and emotionally absent. The pressure of watching his beloved aunt suffer through such a humiliating ordeal gnawed at him, and his focus shifted entirely to protecting her, leaving little energy or patience to repair his collapsing marriage. Portia, instead of leaning on him for strength, found herself consumed by another force of oppression, Drew's relentless control. His shadow hung over her choices, stripping her of independence and slowly suffocating her spirit. Trina saw her mother's spark fade with each day that Drew's grip tightened, and she wondered how long Portia could endure the suffocating manipulation before it destroyed her completely. In the midst of this chaos, Jordan became the most haunting presence of all. Though not a member of the household, her invisible thread of connection to Curtis lingered in every interaction. To Trina, Jordan was like a ghost that refused to rest, a reminder of temptations and past entanglements that her father could never seem to sever. She loomed around the edges of Curtis's life, unwilling to release him, showing up in moments when Trina wished she would stay away. Jordan's silence and composure only made her more dangerous in Trina's eyes, because she represented both a threat and a temptation, the kind of unresolved bond that could tear what remained of Trina's family apart. Trina, unable to bear it, finally sought Jordan out, determined to confront the woman who had become a shadow in her life. It was not an easy decision. She carried both fear and anger in her chest, afraid of what Jordan might say but even more afraid of what she might not say. Trina did not want to lose the remnants of her family, and if Jordan's connection to Curtis lingered unchecked, then there might soon be nothing left at all. When she stood before Jordan, she spoke with trembling conviction, warning her to stay away, pleading in her own way for Jordan to let her parents try to repair what was broken. Trina's eyes held the weight of a child begging for mercy on her family, even if her voice was sharp with blame. Jordan, however, was not a woman easily rattled. She had lived 3 years of secrets, betrayals, and moral compromises, and she had learned to shield her emotions behind calm, carefully measured responses. When Trina's accusations and warnings poured out, Jordan listened, her expression steady, absorbing every word with an unsettling quiet. Instead of reacting with outrage or denial, she responded with the kind of controlled honesty that only made Trina more uneasy. Jordan reminded her that Curtis was not bound in chains, that his choices were his own, and that while she respected Trina's pain, she could not be held solely responsible for fractures that had been forming long before she ever appeared. Her words were not dismissive, but they cut deep, placing the responsibility back where Trina did not want it, in Curtis and Portia themselves. For Trina, hearing such a response was maddening, yet it was also strangely disarming. She had hoped to shame Jordan into retreat, to push her into silence. But instead Jordan's steady demeanor forced Trina to confront the uncomfortable reality that her parents' collapse was not a storm entirely created by outsiders. Still, Jordan's refusal to fully step back or offer assurances left Trina unsettled. She could not shake the sense that Jordan's presence in Curtis's orbit was a constant reminder of temptation and unfinished business, and the thought of that made her heart ache. Even though Jordan's words carried logic, Trina saw them as a veiled excuse, a way to justify continuing to haunt the edges of her family. Jordan's calm responses, though carefully crafted, could not erase the emotional storm inside Trina. Her mind raced with images of Portia slowly breaking under Drew's domination, Curtis drifting further into a shell of worry over Stella, and Jordan standing close enough to Curtis to catch him if he fell. Trina felt surrounded by betrayals she could not control, and though she had stood her ground, she left her conversation with Jordan filled with more fear than relief. She wondered whether her plea had done anything at all, or if Jordan's cool detachment was proof that nothing she said could prevent what felt inevitable. In the aftermath, Trina carried with her both the sting of Jordan's words and the hollow ache of watching her family collapse. She felt trapped between wanting to protect her parents and realizing she had no power to stop the currents pulling them apart. Jordan's answers had not given her closure. They had only sharpened her awareness of how fragile everything had become. As she returned to face her mother and father, she knew that her warning might not be enough to stop the unraveling, and the dread of what might come next weighed on her like an unbearable shadow, leaving her with the painful knowledge that her family was already halfway lost. Second, Brooklyn felt a heaviness in her chest as she sat down across from her father, the silence of the Quartermain mansion pressing in on them. Monica's death had left the entire family reeling, and in the days that followed, grief mingled with tension in ways that felt unbearable. The loss of the family's matriarch had not only robbed them of a stabilizing presence but had also exposed old wounds and hidden resentments. For Brooklyn, it was painful to see the house so full of relatives yet so empty of warmth. She knew her father carried both sorrow and responsibility on his shoulders, and she recognized that if no one reached out, the cracks in their family would widen until there was nothing left to repair. Ned sat stiffly, his expression a mix of grief and weariness. His thoughts caught between mourning Monica and managing the chaos that inevitably arose in a family as wealthy and divided as the Quartermains. He had grown accustomed to carrying the burden of leadership, but this time, even he seemed lost. Brooklyn could see it in the way he avoided eye contact and in the slump of his shoulders, a rare vulnerability from a man so often poised and commanding. She realized then that her father was not just her protector or the figure who had always demanded excellence from her. He was a son-in-law mourning a woman who had shaped the entire family's legacy, and a man facing the storm of what Monica's death meant for their sprawling empire. Brooklyn chose her words carefully, breaking the silence not with demands or accusations but with an honesty she rarely allowed herself to show. She acknowledged the pain they all felt, the way Monica's absence seemed to echo through every hallway and linger over every conversation. She admitted that the house felt colder, that the family felt more fractured, and that she was afraid of what might happen if they let anger, greed, or bitterness control them. By opening up this way, she was offering not just her grief but also her hope that she and Ned could find a way to guide the others toward unity. Ned, listening closely, felt the weight of his daughter's words. For once, she was not approaching him as the impulsive and ambitious Brooklyn he so often clashed with, but as a woman trying to preserve something greater than herself. He could not deny that Monica's passing had left him unmoored, and hearing his daughter speak with such clarity stirred something in him. Yet, beneath his grief, there was the gnawing reality of the Quartermain Fortuna vast wealth, the properties, the companies, and the power tied to their name. He knew that with Monica gone, old disputes about inheritance and influence would erupt like wildfire. Brooklyn acknowledged this too, gently but firmly. She told her father she was not blind to how much money and legacy shaped the dynamics of their family, nor did she deny that it often led to more battles than bonds. But she urged him to remember that no amount of wealth could replace Monica, nor should they let her memory be overshadowed by petty feuds. Her tone was steady, not confrontational, as she reminded him that Monica had always wanted to see the family united, no matter how impossible it sometimes seemed. Brooklyn framed their conversation not as a struggle for control but as a chance to honor Monica by choosing unity over division. Ned leaned back, visibly torn. He had fought so many battles within the family that the thought of another round was exhausting. Yet he also knew his daughter was right. Without a conscious effort, the Quartermains would descend into the chaos they were infamous for. Brooklyn's presence in that moment reminded him that the family still had voices willing to fight for peace rather than power. For the first time since Monica's passing, he felt a flicker of possibility that perhaps grief could be a uniting force rather than a dividing one. If only they could find the courage to rise above their worst impulses. Their conversation deepened as Brooklyn shifted from the abstract to the personal. She admitted that she often struggled with the Quartermain legacy herself, caught between resenting its weight and craving its security. She confessed that Monica had been one of the few who made her feel both seen and understood, encouraging her to embrace her individuality even while carrying the Quartermain name. With tears in her eyes, Brooklyn told her father that she wanted to preserve that spirit in the family. to keep Monica's influence alive not through money or power but through compassion and loyalty. These were words that cut through Ned's defenses, reminding him that the family's true wealth was not in their bank accounts but in their bonds. As their talk came to a close, there was no grand resolution, no sudden transformation of the Quartermaines into a perfectly harmonious clan. But something important had shifted between father and daughter. Brooklyn had extended a hand of honesty and vulnerability, and Ned had taken it, allowing himself to share in her grief rather than hide behind authority. Together, they sat in the quiet, knowing that the days ahead would still be fraught with disputes and heartache, but also aware that they had each other as allies. For the Quartermaines, this was not the end of conflict, but it was a beginning of fragile step toward healing in the wake of devastating loss. Third, Felicia could not shake the gnawing worry in her heart as she thought about James, her grandson who had already endured more emotional turbulence than any child his age should have to. The boy had been forced to process grief far too early, believing at one point that he had lost both his mother and his father. Though Maxie had returned to him, her absences and the chaos surrounding her life often left James feeling insecure. Now, with Nathan's shocking reappearance, the fragile balance James had begun to rebuild seemed poised to collapse. Felicia knew children carried scars from upheavals like these, even if they didn't always show them outwardly. And she feared James might retreat into a shell of confusion and sadness if the adults around him could not provide stability. Nathan's return had been both miraculous and deeply unsettling. For years, everyone had accepted that he was gone, his memory living only in the hearts of those who loved him. His reappearance at the hospital, alive but still weak and undergoing treatment, created an emotional storm that no one was prepared for. Maxie, already shaken by her own struggles, could barely process the reality of Nathan standing in front of her again. Felicia sensed her daughter's panic, not just from shock but from the fear that this impossible twist in fate carried hidden dangers. Nathan's survival raised countless unanswered questions: where he had been, what had happened to him, and why he had been presumed dead for so long. For Maxie, the presence of Nathan was a bittersweet torment. On one hand, she could not deny the relief of seeing him alive, but on the other, it forced her to confront the life she had built without him. She had made decisions, moved on, and tried to give James a sense of normalcy. The idea that Nathan could reappear and unravel all of it terrified her. Even worse, she knew her son would not be able to comprehend the complexity of the situation. To James, his father's return might feel like a dream come true, but it would inevitably be accompanied by heartbreak if the adults around him failed to protect his emotional well-being. Felicia's instincts told her that Maxie was overwhelmed and that James would suffer most if the situation spiraled out of control. James, innocent in all of this, had already been through more shocks than a child should face. He had experienced the devastating belief that he was fatherless, then clung tightly to Maxie only to watch her drift away again during moments when her own struggles consumed her. Now, with Nathan's return, James faced another seismic change. Felicia worried that the boy would be left confused and emotionally destabilized. Unable to reconcile the idea of having both a father who had come back from the dead and a mother who seemed more frightened than overjoyed. Such instability could carve lasting insecurities into his heart, leaving him uncertain about who he could truly depend on. Felicia also feared the potential fallout if Nathan decided he wanted to reclaim his role as James's father in a more direct and legal sense. While Nathan's intentions might come from love, the ripple effect would be devastating. Maxie, who had fought so hard to rebuild her life, would feel threatened, and Spinelli, her current husband, would be placed in an impossible position. Spinelli had stepped in as a father figure, providing James with comfort, guidance, and stability during Nathan's absence. If Nathan demanded custody or sought to re-establish dominance in James's life, Spinelli would find himself caught between his devotion to James, his love for Maxie, and the unavoidable truth that Nathan was James's biological father. The return of Nathan also carried an aura of danger that Felicia could not ignore. People did not vanish for years and re-emerge without consequences, and she feared that Nathan's survival came at a cost. Perhaps he had been entangled in something dark, something that might follow him back into Port Charles. If so, the threat would not only hang over Nathan but also over Maxie, James, and anyone tied to them. Felicia's protective instincts as both a mother and grandmother screamed that Nathan's presence was not as simple as a miracle, it was a complication layered with potential risks. Felicia's concern for James extended beyond the immediate situation. She understood that children thrived on consistency and emotional safety, and James had neither at the moment. If the adults around him fell into conflict, if Maxie's panic escalated, or if Spinelli began to feel displaced, James would inevitably absorb that turmoil. Felicia worried that he might internalize the idea that he was the cause of everyone's pain, a common burden children carried in fractured families. She wanted to shield him from that weight, to ensure that his well-being remained the central priority, but she knew her voice alone might not be enough to sway the decisions of the adults. Ultimately, Felicia's fears were not misplaced. Nathan's return was a miracle, but it was also a storm, one that had the potential to heal or destroy depending on how it was handled. James, fragile and impressionable, stood at the heart of that storm, and Felicia's heart ached with the knowledge that he could so easily become collateral damage. Her vigilance and concern came from a place of love, from her determination to protect her grandson from further heartbreak. Whether or not the others would listen to her warnings remained uncertain, but Felicia knew that her worries for James were justified. In a world already rife with shocks and betrayals, his innocence was something worth fighting fiercely to preserve. Fourth, Portia left the house with her chest heavy and her heart full of frustration, the echoes of her argument with Curtis still ringing in her ears. Their marriage had become suffocating, a cycle of tension and disappointment that neither of them seemed able to break. Every conversation ended in conflict, every attempt at reconciliation turned into a deeper wound. The walls of their home, once meant to shelter them, now felt like a cage where love had drained away, leaving only blame and silence. Portia, exhausted and desperate for release, found herself driving to Isaiah's place without fully acknowledging the reasons why. When she arrived at his door, the unspoken truth between them immediately filled the air. Isaiah had been there before, offering her a kind of comfort that blurred the lines between friendship and forbidden desire. They had already crossed boundaries once, a moment that Portia later tried to dismiss by insisting they were nothing more than friends. But even as she spoke those words, she had known deep down that something lingered between them, something she could not completely deny. And now, as she stood before him again after yet another painful clash with her husband, that fragile barrier she had built around herself began to crumble. Isaiah welcomed her inside with quiet understanding, his presence both soothing and dangerous. He had always been able to read her emotions with a clarity that Curtis no longer seemed capable of. With him, she did not have to fight for space to breathe. She could let down her guard and simply exist. Portia knew it was reckless to seek solace here, but the weight of her fractured marriage pressed her forward. The conversation between them was brief, filled with glances heavy with meaning, and soon words gave way to something else entirely. As it had before, one thing led to another, and they crossed the line again. Portia told herself she was weak, that she should have turned away, but in Isaiah's arms she found the escape she had been craving. The tenderness, the passion, the way he looked at her as though she mattered beyond the burdens of family calls, it all contrasted sharply with the cold, suffocating distance she now felt with Curtis. Each moment with Isaiah pulled her further from the life she had built and deeper into a dangerous entanglement that she knew could not stay hidden forever. When it was over, the guilt settled in like a shadow, but so did a sense of inevitability. Portia could no longer pretend that her marriage to Curtis was simply going through a difficult phase. The cracks had widened beyond repair, and every attempt to mend them only pushed her further away. Curtis's struggles with Stella's arrest, his inability to see past his own anger, and the suffocating tension in their household had already made her feel alone in her marriage. Isaiah had become the person she turned to, not because it was right, but because she no longer believed she could find comfort with her husband. Curtis, meanwhile, remained blind to the extent of Portia's unraveling loyalty, but the distance between them was impossible to ignore. He sensed her detachment, her lack of warmth, and each cold silence fueled his own resentment. Their marriage, once held together by promises of love and commitment, was deteriorating rapidly. Trust, once broken, refused to return, and intimacy between them had all but vanished. Portia's infidelity only solidified what she already knew deep down, that their union was becoming irretrievably broken. The more Portia turned to Isaiah, the more impossible it became for her to envision a future with Curtis. Each secret meeting, each forbidden moment, drove another wedge into her marriage. She tried to justify her actions as temporary, as a misguided search for comfort, but the truth was clearer than she wanted to admit. She had made a choice, whether she was ready to face it or not. The marriage she shared with Curtis was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield that drained her spirit. Isaiah, though far from a safe choice, had become her refuge. In the end, Portia's decisions carved a path that would only lead to further heartbreak. Her betrayal ensured that even if she and Curtis attempted reconciliation, their foundation was already destroyed. What had once been a marriage full of potential had now become a hollow shell, collapsing under the weight of secrets and resentments. And as Portia left Isaiah's place once again, she knew in her heart that her return home would feel emptier than ever. The spiral had begun, and there was no turning back. Her marriage to Curtis was moving closer and closer to an end that could not be salvaged. Finally, Tracy had always been a woman driven by ambition and a sharp instinct for survival. But after Monica's death, her calculating nature surfaced in ways that shocked even those who knew her best. For years, Monica had served as both a rival and a stabilizer within the Quartermaine clan, a matriarch whose authority often kept Tracy's schemes in check. With her gone, Tracy saw not only a family in mourning but also an empire suddenly vulnerable. The vast Quartermaine fortune spanning properties, shares, and legacy wealth was fractured by grief, and Tracy sensed an opportunity too tempting to ignore. In her mind, this was not just about money, it was about power, control, and cementing her place as the unquestioned head of the family. Her first moves were subtle, disguised as grief-driven decisions for the good of the family. She positioned herself as a guiding hand, someone who could steer the Quartermaines through the chaos. But beneath the surface, every choice she made carried a hidden motive. She began quietly reviewing old legal documents, assessing the weaknesses in the estate plans Monica had left behind, and identifying which family members could be manipulated or outmaneuvered. The cracks were there. Brooklyn was too young and emotionally invested, Ned was overwhelmed by grief, and others were distracted by their own battles. Tracy, sharper than ever, knew timing was everything, and she was ready to strike. The sheer size of the Quartermaine estate made it an alluring prize. Their corporate holdings alone gave them influence across Port Charles and beyond, but the properties, investments, and trust funds meant a staggering amount of control rested on who could seize the upper hand. Tracy understood the terrain better than anyone, and she knew that Monica's absence created confusion over leadership. The family was too divided to stand as a united front, and she was determined to use that division to her advantage. To her, mourning was nothing more than a distraction for others while she plotted in silence. Still, Tracy's ambition was not without risk. She was playing with fire, challenging fate by attempting to dominate a family that had always thrived on conflict. One misstep could turn the rest of the Quartermaines against her, forcing them to unite in opposition. Yet the thrill of the gamble only fueled her determination. She had spent her life clawing for recognition and authority in a world dominated by powerful men, and now, with Monica gone, she believed destiny had left the throne empty for her to claim. It was not just about inheritance, it was about legacy, about ensuring the Quartermaine name was tied to her strength, not Monica's. As she maneuvered through family dinners, board meetings, and private conversations, Tracy began to show her true hand. She undermined Ned's confidence, questioned Brooklyn's maturity, and whispered doubts into the ears of others who might oppose her. She presented herself as the only stable choice to protect the family's fortune, painting her actions as sacrifice when in truth they were calculated power plays. The others, consumed by grief, often failed to notice the precision of her moves, allowing her to gain more control with each passing day. But Tracy was also aware of the shadows of consequence that lingered around her. The Quartermaine family had a history of chaos, and the wealth they possessed had always come with a curse of betrayal, scandal, and heartbreak. By attempting to claim everything, she was daring fate itself, testing whether she could bend destiny to her will. The question was not only whether she could succeed, but whether the price of such victory would leave her even more isolated than before. Power, after all, came with enemies, and Tracy risked alienating the very family she sought to rule. In her quiet moments, she justified her choices with the belief that she was protecting the Quartermain legacy. She told herself that only she had the strength to keep the empire intact, that others were too emotional, too indecisive, or too distracted to carry the burden. But deep down, Tracy knew her hunger for control had always been personal. It was about proving herself, about finally stepping out from the shadow of those who had dismissed her or underestimated her, and about rewriting the family narrative with her name at the center. As she continued her relentless pursuit, the Quartermain household braced unknowingly for the storm she was unleashing. The balance between grief and greed tipped further by the day, and the fragile threads holding the family together strained under the weight of her ambition. Tracy had chosen her path, daring fate to stop her, and in doing so, she risked turning the aftermath of Monica's death into the greatest Quartermain war yet, a battle not of outsiders but of blood, inheritance, and the dangerous hunger for power that had defined their dynasty for generations.